I was watching my stepbrother Marcus's face turn purple with rage from across the mahogany conference table when I realized this was the exact moment I'd died for in my previous life. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his perfectly styled hair finally showing signs of disorder as he ran his hands through it frantically. "That patent is mine. I've been working on it for 3 years." I leaned back in my leather chair, savoring every second of his panic. The lawyers flanking me remained professionally stoic, but I could see the hint of a smile on my lead attorney's face. She'd enjoyed preparing this case almost as much as I was enjoying watching it unfold. "Actually, Marcus," I said, my voice honey-sweet, "according to the timestamps on these development logs, the patent application, and approximately 47 pieces of documented evidence, the biotechnology process you're claiming as your own was developed by me, in my lab, using my equipment, with my team." I paused, letting each word land like a hammer. "You just stole the paperwork and submitted it under your name." His wife, Melissa, the same woman who used to mock me at family dinners for being a foolish dreamer, had gone completely pale. She clutched her Birkin bag like it might shield her from what was coming. "This is insane," Marcus finally managed. "Mom, Dad, are you going to let her get away with this?" I turned my gaze to my stepmother, Patricia, and my father, sitting at the end of the table. Patricia's lips were pressed into a thin line, her face a mask of barely controlled fury. My father wouldn't even meet my eyes. He just stared at the documents in front of him, his hands trembling slightly. "Good. Let them shake." "The court date is set for 3 weeks from now," my attorney announced, standing up and gathering her files. "But given the overwhelming evidence, I'd strongly suggest you consider settling. The criminal charges for intellectual property theft alone could result in—" "Criminal charges?" Melissa's voice came out as a squeak. I stood up, smoothing down my Tom Ford blazer. In my previous life, I'd died in a threadbare sweater and jeans, poisoned by the very people now staring at me with hatred and fear. In this life, I wore custom-tailored power suits and $20,000 watches. "See you in court," I said pleasantly, "or at the settlement table. Either way, I win." I walked out of that conference room with my head held high, my heels clicking against the marble floor with a satisfying rhythm. Behind me, I could hear Marcus starting to shout, his voice echoing off the walls. Let him scream. I'd screamed plenty in my past life and no one had listened. This time, the whole world would hear me. The first time I died, I was 28 years old and still stupid enough to believe that hard work and talent would eventually earn my family's respect. I'd been wrong. It happened on a Tuesday, which felt absurdly mundane for a murder. I'd been working in my cramped studio apartment, the one I could barely afford despite working 2 jobs alongside my doctoral research, when Patricia called to invite me to a family dinner. I should have known something was wrong. Patricia never invited me anywhere unless she wanted something or needed to maintain appearances in front of someone important. But I was tired, lonely, and desperately hopeful that maybe, just maybe, things were changing. The dinner was at their house, of course. The sprawling estate in the suburbs that my father had bought with money from his software company. The company he'd built with seed funding from my late mother's life insurance policy. The same company he'd promised would be our legacy before he married Patricia 6 months after Mom's funeral. I was 18 when he remarried. Marcus was 20, already graduated from business school thanks to strings pulled and donations made. He'd waltzed into a VP position at Dad's company while I was still struggling to pay for my undergraduate degree in biochemistry. Your mother would have wanted you to be practical, Dad had said when I'd asked for help with tuition. Maybe choose something more marketable. Biochemistry? What are you going to do with that? Save lives, I'd answered. Develop new medicines. Make a difference. He'd laughed. Actually laughed. That's very sweet, honey, but let's be realistic. You're not exactly MIT material. Community college has excellent nursing programs. I'd paid my own way through undergrad, working nights at a diner and weekends at a pharmacy. I'd graduated summa cum laude and got accepted into one of the top doctoral programs in the country on a full scholarship. I'd sent Dad the acceptance letter, hoping for pride, for recognition, for anything. He'd never mentioned it, not once. But I kept trying. I kept showing up to family dinners where Marcus would talk about his innovative ideas for the company, ideas I later realized he was pulling from business blogs and TED Talks. I kept smiling when Patricia would make passive-aggressive comments about my interesting fashion choices and ambitious career plans. I kept pretending that someday they'd see me. The day I died, I'd just had a major breakthrough in my research. I'd been working on a new process for synthesizing certain proteins that could revolutionize cancer treatment. It was brilliant, groundbreaking work, the kind of thing that could save millions of lives and, yes, make millions of dollars. I'd been so excited that I'd brought my research notes to dinner, thinking maybe Dad would finally understand. Maybe he'd finally see that I wasn't just his disappointment of a daughter, but a scientist on the verge of something incredible. I'd been such a fool. Dinner was pleasant enough at first. Patricia had made her signature roast, or rather, their private chef had made it. And Marcus was in a good mood, talking about some new project he was launching. I'd waited for the right moment, then pulled out my folder. Dad, I'd said, my heart pounding, I wanted to show you something. I've made a breakthrough in my research and— Not at the dinner table, Claire, Patricia had interrupted, her voice sharp. We're trying to have a pleasant family meal. But this is important, I'd insisted, looking at my father. Dad, this could change everything. If we could get some initial funding for trials— Funding? Marcus had laughed. Claire, come on, you're still in grad school. What do you know about commercializing research? I know that this process could save lives, I'd shot back. And yes, it could be worth a fortune if it even works, Patricia had said dismissively. Darling, we support your little hobby, but you have to understand that real business requires more than just laboratory experiments. It's not a hobby, I'd said, my voice rising despite my best efforts to stay calm. It's 5 years of research, thousands of hours of work. Which you did for a degree, Dad had finally spoken, his voice tired. That's what graduate school is for, Claire. You learn, you get your PhD, and then you get a nice position at some university or pharmaceutical company. Let the business people handle the business side. But Claire. His voice had held a note of finality. I'm not investing in pipe dreams. If you want to play scientist, fine, but don't expect me to fund it. I'd felt the familiar sting of tears and hated myself for it. I'd stood up, gathering my folder with shaking hands. Fine, I'd said quietly. I'll do it myself. I always do. I'd started to leave, but Patricia had called after me. Oh, Claire, before you go, you look pale. Are you feeling all right? You should take some vitamins. She'd handed me a bottle. I picked these up for you. Special formulation. Very expensive. I'd been touched despite everything. It was the first genuinely kind gesture she'd made in years. I'd taken the bottle, thanked her, and left. I'd taken 2 pills when I got home that night. By morning, I was dead. The doctors called it a heart attack, unusual for someone my age, but not unheard of in high-stress individuals. The funeral was small. Dad had seemed genuinely sad, which almost made it worse. Marcus had given a beautiful eulogy about his brilliant little sister who'd worked so hard. Patricia had cried prettily into a lace handkerchief. I'd watched it all from wherever souls go when they're not quite ready to move on. I'd watched Marcus go to my apartment after the funeral and take my research. All of it. Every notebook, every file, every sample. I'd watched him bring it to his office and start reading through it with growing excitement. I'd watched him present my work to Dad as his own new initiative 6 months later. I'd watched Dad beam with pride and approve a massive research budget. I'd watched Patricia toast to her brilliant son at a family celebration I would never attend. And I'd watched as the fury built inside me until it burned hot enough to drag me back. I woke up on my 18th birthday, 6 hours before my father's wedding to Patricia. The first thing I did was vomit. The second thing I did was laugh hysterically until my grandmother, still alive in this timeline, still the only person who'd ever truly loved me, came running into my room in concern. Claire, sweetheart, are you all right? I'd looked at her, this woman who would die 2 years from now from a stroke, and grabbed her hands. Grandma, I'd said, I need to tell you something crazy and I need you to believe me. She'd sat down on my bed, her wise eyes studying my face. Go ahead, dear. and I told her everything. All of it. My entire first life, my death, Marcus's theft, everything. I'd expected skepticism, disbelief, maybe concern for my mental health. Instead, she'd nodded slowly and said, "I always knew that woman was poison." It turned out my grandmother had never trusted Patricia, had never liked the quick marriage after my mother's death, had always suspected ulterior motives. But she'd kept quiet because she thought Dad was happy and didn't want to cause family drama. "I won't make that mistake again," she'd said firmly. "What do you need?" What I'd needed was time, resources, and protection. Grandma had all three. She was independently wealthy from her own career as a patent attorney. Ironic, given what was coming. And she'd been planning to leave me her estate anyway. Instead, she'd accelerated the timeline. Within a month of my rebirth, I'd had a trust fund, a lawyer, and a plan. I'd also made a decision. I wasn't going to just avoid my death this time. I was going to systematically dismantle every single person who'd destroyed me in my previous life. I was going to take everything they'd stolen and more. I was going to make them watch as I became everything they'd never believed I could be, and I was going to enjoy every second of it. The first change I'd made was simple. I'd skipped my father's wedding, claimed food poisoning, stayed home with Grandma, and used the time to start mapping out my strategy. Patricia had been furious. I could tell from the cold voice messages she'd left. But Dad had been too caught up in newlywed bliss to care much. The second change was my education. In my previous life, I'd struggled to pay for a state school, taking whatever financial aid I could get and working myself to exhaustion. This time, I'd had Grandma's resources and my own foreknowledge. I'd known exactly what to study, which professors to impress, which research to pursue. I'd gotten into MIT. Full scholarship plus a stipend, but I'd accepted anyway just for the prestige and the access to better resources. Marcus had been 22 then, already ensconced in his VP office at Dad's company. At family dinners, the ones I still occasionally attended, playing the role of dutiful daughter while secretly recording every conversation. He'd made snide comments about fancy schools and impractical degrees. "I mean, biochemistry?" he'd said at Thanksgiving dinner my freshman year. "What are you going to do? Discover the cure for cancer?" He'd laughed like it was the funniest joke in the world. I'd smiled sweetly. Maybe. What I'd actually been doing at MIT was accelerating my research timeline. I'd known exactly where my previous life's breakthrough had been leading, and I'd had 10 years of hindsight to refine it. I'd also been careful, so careful, to document everything, to timestamp every file, to create an unbreakable chain of evidence proving that this work was mine. By my junior year, I'd already filed my first patent. A process for protein synthesis that was revolutionary enough to attract attention from major pharmaceutical companies, but not so world-changing that it would paint a target on my back too early. I'd licensed it for a small fortune and used that money to set up my own lab. Marcus had sneered when he'd heard. "Playing entrepreneur? Claire, you're barely 20. You have no idea what you're doing." "Probably not," I'd agreed mildly, but I'll learn. What he hadn't known was that I'd already learned. I'd lived an entire lifetime, died, and come back with knowledge that was worth more than any MBA. By the time I'd graduated from MIT at 21, a year early because I'd tested out of several classes I'd already taken in my previous life, I'd had 3 patents, a functional laboratory, and a small team of researchers who were loyal to me personally. I'd also had something else. The beginnings of my breakthrough work, the real breakthrough, the one that Marcus had stolen and corrupted in my previous life. I'd been careful with it this time. I'd worked on it in secret in my private lab with only my most trusted team members. I'd documented every single step with timestamps, video logs, and blockchain verification. I'd created a paper trail so detailed and comprehensive that it would be impossible to dispute. And then I'd waited for Marcus to make his move. I'd known it would come. Men like Marcus, raised on entitlement and lazy greed, always took the easy route. Why do the hard work when you could steal someone else's? In my previous life, he'd simply taken my research after I'd died, facing no consequences because who would question a grieving brother going through his sister's belongings? This time, he'd have to work for it. I'd started dropping hints at family dinners about my promising research and how it could be worth millions. I'd made sure to leave my lab occasionally unlocked when I knew he was in the area. I'd created fake backup files on my laptop that were detailed enough to look real, but incomplete enough to be useless without the actual data. It had taken 6 months, but he'd finally taken the bait. I'd gotten the alert on my phone at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday. Unauthorized access to my laboratory computer system. The keylogger I'd installed had immediately started recording every keystroke, every file opened, every document copied. I'd watched from my apartment as Marcus, using a stolen keycard he'd probably paid one of my lab techs for, had copied my research files onto a USB drive. I'd watched him stuff the drive into his pocket and leave, looking around nervously like the amateur criminal he was. I'd watched, and I'd smiled, and I'd gone back to sleep. Because what Marcus had stolen wasn't my real research. It was a carefully constructed trail of breadcrumbs that would lead him to believe he'd hit the jackpot while actually walking straight into a trap. The real research, the actual breakthrough that would revolutionize cancer treatment, was stored in encrypted servers with military-grade security, accessible only through biometric verification that only I could provide. But Marcus didn't know that. Marcus thought he'd outsmarted his naive little sister and stolen the work of a lifetime. Over the next year, I'd watched him work. He'd been surprisingly competent at hiding his theft, I had to admit. He'd taken the stolen research and used it to build his own revolutionary biotech initiative at Dad's company. He'd hired a team of researchers to refine the process, really just to finish the work I'd deliberately left incomplete in the fake files. He'd been so proud of himself. At family dinners, he'd talked endlessly about his groundbreaking work and how it was going to transform the company. Dad had practically glowed with pride. Patricia had preened like she'd personally given birth to genius. I'd played my part perfectly. I'd expressed frustration about my own research hitting roadblocks. I'd complained about funding issues and technical difficulties. I'd let them think I was struggling while Marcus soared. And all the while, I'd been building my case. Every keystroke from the night of the theft was logged and time-stamped. Every file he'd accessed had been watermarked with invisible metadata. The security camera footage of him entering my lab had been backed up to 3 separate secure servers. I'd even had a private investigator document his meetings with the lab tech he'd bribed, complete with photos and wire transfer records. But I'd waited. Patience, I'd learned, was the ultimate weapon. I'd let Marcus develop his process. I'd let him file for the patent under his name. I'd let him pitch it to investors and start securing funding. I'd let him get comfortable, confident, convinced that he'd finally proven himself as brilliant as everyone had always told him he was. And then, when he'd been featured in Forbes magazine as one of 30 under 30 to watch in biotechnology, when Dad had publicly praised him as the future of the company, when Patricia had thrown him a celebration dinner to which I'd been invited as an afterthought, that's when I'd struck. The lawsuit had been filed on a Monday morning. Patent infringement, intellectual property theft, fraud, and half a dozen other charges that my grandmother's former law firm, now my law firm, had put together with surgical precision. The evidence was overwhelming. The timestamps alone proved that my work predated his by over a year. The security footage showed him physically stealing the files. The keylogger data revealed exactly what he'd taken and when. The metadata in every file he'd submitted in his patent application matched the files I'd created as bait. It was airtight, unbreakable, devastating. Marcus had tried to deny it at first, of course, claimed I was lying, that I was jealous, that I was making it all up because I couldn't stand to see him succeed. But then my lawyers had released the security footage to his lawyers. Then the keylogger logs, then the metadata analysis, then the real bombshell. I'd filed my own patent application for the actual breakthrough work, the real research, the complete process, 6 months before Marcus had even stolen the fake files. My patent had been kept sealed pending approval, which had just come through. The same week I'd filed the lawsuit, I didn't just have proof that Marcus had stolen from me, I had proof that what he'd stolen was deliberately incomplete, and that I'd been sitting on the real breakthrough the entire time. The media had gone insane. Biotech wunderkind steals sister's research was the kindest headline. Others were more brutal. Silver spoon son caught in billion-dollar theft. Family betrayal rocks tech industry. The sister he underestimated. How Claire Chen beat her brother at his own game. Within a week, Marcus had been suspended from Dad's company pending investigation. Within 2 weeks, criminal charges had been filed. Within a month, the settlement talks had begun, but I wasn't interested in settling. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday, exactly 10 years to the day after I'd died in my previous life. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Marcus looked terrible. The golden boy's sheen had worn off, revealing the mediocre, entitled man underneath. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he'd lost or the dark circles under his eyes. Melissa wasn't with him this time. She'd filed for separation 2 weeks ago, once she'd realized the gravy train was derailing. My father was there, though, and Patricia. They sat behind Marcus like they were at a funeral, which, in a way, they were. The death of their perfect family illusion. The deposition lasted 7 hours. My lawyers methodically went through every piece of evidence, every timestamp, every lie Marcus had told. They made him explain on the record how he'd obtained access to my laboratory, how he'd copied the files, what he'd done with them. He tried to claim he'd thought the research was collaborative work, that I'd given him permission, that it was a misunderstanding. My lead attorney had smiled and pulled out a recording from my keylogger of Marcus on the phone with his wife after the theft. I got it, his voice crackled through the speakers, all of it. Claire's too stupid to see what she has. This is going to make me millions. Melissa's voice had responded, Are you sure she won't notice? She's too busy playing scientist to pay attention to the real world. By the time she figures it out, if she ever does, it'll be too late. The patent will be mine. The silence in that deposition room after the recording ended was absolute. Marcus had gone gray. Dad had put his head in his hands. Patricia had simply stared at the table, her expression unreadable. No further questions, my attorney had said pleasantly. The settlement offer came the next day. Marcus would surrender all claims to the patent, make a public apology, pay damages of $15 million, and resign from Dad's company. In exchange, I wouldn't pursue jail time. I'd read the offer twice, then looked at my legal team. Counteroffer, I'd said. He surrenders the patent claims and makes the public apology. But I want $50 million in damages, and I am pursuing criminal charges. Also, I want a full audit of Dad's company to see if there are any other instances of intellectual property theft or fraud. My attorney had raised an eyebrow. The criminal charges will be harder to get with his family's resources, and they'll fight the audits. I'll let them fight, I'd said. I have time. What I'd had was more than time. I'd had knowledge. Because in my previous life, Dad's company had collapsed 3 years after my death due to a series of bad decisions, and it turned out some creative accounting that bordered on fraud. Marcus had been at the helm when it happened, having taken over as CEO. I'd always wondered if some of that had been incompetence or something darker. Now I had the resources to find out. The audit had revealed some interesting things. Nothing overtly criminal, Dad was too smart for that, but plenty of questionable business practices, questionable deductions, and at least 3 instances where Marcus had claimed company resources for personal use. The IRS had been very interested in my findings. Between the patent lawsuit, the criminal investigation, and the IRS audit, Marcus's life had become a living hell. He'd lost his job, his wife, his reputation, and most of his money to legal fees. Dad's company had taken a massive hit in the stock market. Investors didn't like the optics of a VP stealing from his own sister, and they liked the IRS investigation even less. But I still wasn't done. Because the patent I'd filed, my real research, the breakthrough that would actually work, was already generating interest from pharmaceutical companies. I'd licensed the rights for initial trials to 3 different companies, each paying me a substantial upfront fee plus royalties on any resulting treatments. Conservative estimates put the eventual value at over $1 billion. I'd use some of that money to expand my laboratory, hire the best researchers in the field, and accelerate development. I'd used more of it to set up a foundation in my mother's name for young women in STEM fields, everything from scholarships to research grants to startup funding. And I'd used a portion of it to buy a controlling interest in my father's company when the stock price had tanked. The board meeting where that had been revealed had been something out of a movie. I'd walked into that conference room, the same one where Marcus had raged at me months before, and taken my seat at the table. Dad had looked confused. Claire, what are you doing here? I'd smiled and opened my portfolio. I'm here for the board meeting, Dad, as the majority shareholder. The silence had been deafening. That's impossible, Patricia had said. You owned 42%, I'd corrected. Past tense. I've been acquiring shares through various investment vehicles over the past 6 months. As of yesterday, I own 51% of this company. My father's face had gone through several colors before settling on a grayish white. You can't. I can, I'd said pleasantly. And I have. Which brings me to the first order of business, accepting the resignation of the current CEO. Dad had stood up, his hands shaking. I built this company. Your mother's money helped, yes, but I built it into what it is today. What it is today is a company under investigation by the IRS, with a tarnished reputation and falling stock prices, I'd interrupted. What it is today is a company that needs new leadership, someone with vision, ethics, and actual talent. And you think that's you? Marcus had spat from his seat. He'd showed up despite no longer being an employee, probably hoping to support Dad. I'd looked at him, really looked at him, and felt nothing but pity. He was so small, so mediocre, so desperately clinging to a sense of superiority that had never been earned. I know it's me, I'd said simply. I have 3 patents worth a combined $1 billion. I run a successful research laboratory. I've built a foundation that's already helped hundreds of young women achieve their dreams. What have you built, Marcus, besides a fraud case? He'd had no answer to that. The vote had been a formality. With my 51%, I'd had the controlling vote. I'd installed myself as CEO and brought in a new board of directors. People I trusted. People with integrity. I'd offered Dad a choice: retire with a generous pension or stay on as a consultant with severely limited authority. He'd chosen retirement. Patricia had tried to play the concerned stepmother, approaching me after the meeting with tears in her eyes. Claire, sweetheart, I know things have been difficult, but we're still family. I'd cut her off with a look that could have frozen hell. We were never family, I'd said quietly. You married my father for his money. You raised your son to be a thief and a fraud, and I'd paused, remembering the vitamins, the poison, the death I'd died in my previous life. I had no proof of that here, not in this timeline, but I knew. You've never done a single genuine thing in your life. How dare you? I dare because I can, I'd said. Because I'm not that desperate, lonely girl anymore, begging for scraps of approval from people who never deserved my love. I'm Claire Chen, CEO and majority shareholder. I'm Dr. Claire Chen, holder of multiple patents. I'm the woman who beat you all at a game you didn't even know we were playing. I'd walked away from her then, leaving her standing in that conference room with the ruins of her perfect life scattered around her. The criminal trial for Marcus's theft had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was so overwhelming that his lawyers had tried multiple times to get him to plead guilty and hope for leniency. He'd refused. Right up until the end, Marcus had believed that somehow, some way, his privilege would save him. That Dad's money or Patricia's connections or just the sheer unfairness of the world would mean he'd walk away from this. He'd been wrong. The jury had deliberated for 4 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts: intellectual property theft, fraud, breaking and entering, and a handful of other charges my lawyers had made stick. The judge had sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay $60 million in damages, the 50 I'd asked for plus additional punitive damages. Melissa had divorced him before he'd even started serving time. She'd taken what was left of his assets in the settlement and disappeared to somewhere in Europe with her new boyfriend. Patricia had tried to visit him in prison, but after the 3rd visit, where he'd apparently screamed at her for raising him wrong and not preparing him for the real world, she'd stopped going. Dad had aged 10 years in the months since everything had fallen apart. He'd tried to reach out to me a few times, awkward phone calls where he'd attempted to apologize without actually taking responsibility. I never meant for things to turn out this way, he'd said during the last call. I just wanted what was best for everyone. No, I'd corrected gently. You wanted what was easiest. There's a difference. He'd had nothing to say to that. 2 years after the trial, my treatment protocol had entered phase 3 clinical trials. The results were extraordinary. Remission rates were higher than anything currently on the market, with minimal side effects. The FDA approval was expected within the year, and conservative estimates suggested it would save over 100,000 lives annually once it was widely available. I'd been featured on the cover of Time magazine, The Scientist Who Saved Herself. The article had detailed my story, the family betrayal, the theft, the legal battle, and the ultimate triumph. It had been gratifying to see it all laid out in print, to have the world know what I'd overcome. But the most satisfying moment had come on a Tuesday, because apparently Tuesdays were my day for poetic justice. I'd been invited to give the keynote speech at the National Biotechnology Conference, one of the most prestigious events in the field. The ballroom had been packed with thousands of scientists, researchers, and industry leaders. And in the third row, looking small and uncomfortable in a suit he probably couldn't afford anymore, had been my father. I'd spotted him as I'd taken the stage, and for just a moment I'd frozen. Memories had flooded back. Both lives, both versions of this man. The father who'd laughed at my dreams. The father who'd chosen his new wife over his daughter. The father who'd let his son steal from me and then praised him for it. But also, the father who'd once taken me to science museums when I was little. Who'd helped me build my first chemistry set. Who'd told me I could do anything if I worked hard enough. Before he'd decided I wasn't worth the investment. I'd taken a breath, centered myself, and begun my speech. I'd talked about my research, about the breakthrough, about the potential to save lives. I talked about the challenges of being a young woman in STEM, about fighting for recognition in a field that often overlooked female scientists. And then, at the end, I'd gone off script. Someone once told me that my career choice was stupid, I'd said, my voice echoing through the silent ballroom. That biochemistry was impractical, that I should choose something more marketable. That I wasn't MIT material. I'd seen Dad shift in his seat, his face going red. That person was wrong, I'd continued, not just about me, but about what constitutes success. They measured worth in dollars and status and conventional achievement. They couldn't see that the real measure of a life well lived is how many other lives you improve. I'd paused, looking directly at him. I'm happy to report that my stupid career choice is on track to save millions of lives. And yes, it's also made me wealthier than everyone who doubted me combined. But that's not why I do this work. I do it because every person who goes into remission because of my research is a testament to the girl who was told she couldn't, and did anyway. The standing ovation had lasted 5 minutes. Dad had slipped out before it ended. He'd sent me an email later that night, short, simple. I'm proud of you. I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. I'd read it 3 times, waiting to feel something. Vindication, maybe? Or closure. Instead, I'd just felt tired. I'd deleted the email and gone back to work. The foundation I'd created in my mother's name had become one of the most respected organizations in STEM education. We'd awarded over 500 scholarships, funded dozens of research projects, and helped launch 30 startup companies founded by women scientists. Every year, we held a gala to honor the recipients and donors. It was one of my favorite events, a chance to meet brilliant young women who reminded me of myself, who had the talent and drive but lacked the resources or support. This year's gala was particularly special because we'd invited my grandmother as the guest of honor. She was 85 now, still sharp as ever, and I'd never been able to properly thank her for believing in me when no one else had. She'd taken the stage in her elegant silver gown, looking every inch the successful attorney she'd been, and given a speech that had half the room in tears. When my granddaughter came to me at 18 and told me she'd lived an entire other life, that she'd died and come back with a second chance, Grandma had said, her voice strong and clear. I had 2 choices. I could dismiss her as confused or troubled, or I could listen. She'd paused, looking directly at me in the front row. I chose to listen. And in doing so, I got to watch one of the most brilliant people I've ever known build an empire of kindness and innovation. I got to watch her take her pain and transform it into purpose. I got to watch her prove that the measure of a person isn't where they start, but what they do with the opportunities they create for themselves. I'd lost the battle with my tears at that point. After the gala, Grandma and I had sat in my penthouse apartment, the one with the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, so different from the cramped studio where I'd died in my previous life, drinking wine and talking. Do you ever regret it? She'd asked. The path you chose? You could have just avoided them, lived your life in peace. I'd thought about it, really considered the question. No, I'd finally said, a sin. Peace would have meant always wondering what if, always looking over my shoulder. This way, I know I won, completely, utterly, and in a way they can never take from me. And your father? She'd asked gently. Do you think you'll ever reconcile? I'd swirled the wine in my glass, watching the light catch in the deep red liquid. I don't know, I'd admitted. Part of me wants to believe people can change, that maybe he's genuinely sorry. But the other part of me remembers every time he chose Patricia over me, every time he dismissed my dreams, every time he praised Marcus for achievements built on stolen ground. You don't owe him forgiveness, Grandma had said firmly, but I thought, no matter what anyone tells you. I know, I'd said. But sometimes I wonder if holding on to the anger hurts me more than it hurts him. She'd patted my hand. That's something only you can answer, dear. But whatever you decide, know that I'm proud of you. Your mother would be proud of you. We'd sat in comfortable silence after that, watching the city lights twinkle below us. 3 years after the trial, I'd received an unexpected visitor at my office. Marcus had been released from prison after serving 2 years of his sentence. He'd lost weight, gained some gray hair, and had the look of a man who'd been thoroughly broken and was trying to put himself back together. My assistant had called up, uncertain. Dr. Chen, your brother is here. He says he needs to speak with you. I'd almost said no, almost had security escort him out, but curiosity had won. Send him up, I'd said. He'd walked into my office, the corner office on the top floor of the building that housed my laboratory and foundation, and stopped, taking it all in. The awards on the walls, the framed patents, the photos of me with world leaders and Nobel Prize winners. Nice place, he'd finally said. Thank you, I'd replied, not inviting him to sit. What do you want, Marcus? He'd flinched at my tone but pressed on. I wanted to apologize. In person, not because my lawyer told me to or because I'm trying to get something from you, just because I'm sorry. I'd studied him, looking for the lie, the angle, the manipulation, but all I'd seen was a tired, defeated man. Okay, I'd said. He'd blinked. Okay? You're sorry, I heard you. Is there anything else? He'd struggled for words. I know I can't undo what I did. I know I can't make it right, but I wanted you to know that I understand now, what I took from you, what I cost you. You didn't cost me anything, I'd said flatly. You tried to, but you failed. If anything, you gave me the perfect motivation to succeed beyond your wildest imagination. He'd actually laughed at that, a bitter sound. Yeah, I definitely did that. He'd paused. For what it's worth, your treatment saved someone I knew. In prison. Guy had stage 4 cancer, given months to live. Your protocol put him in remission. I'd felt something shift in my chest. I'm glad. Me too. He'd turned to leave, then stopped. I know you don't owe me anything, but would you ever consider, could we ever be brother and sister? I'd finished for him. No, Marcus, we can't. That ship didn't just sail. You burned it and sank the ashes. He'd nodded, like he'd expected that answer. Yeah, I figured. He'd taken a few more steps toward the door, then turned back one last time. I really am sorry, Claire. Not for getting caught. For doing it in the first place. You deserved better from all of us. After he'd left, I'd sat at my desk for a long time processing. I didn't forgive him, might never forgive him. But somehow his apology had lifted a weight I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. 5 years after my rebirth, I'd achieved everything I'd set out to do and more. My cancer treatment had received full FDA approval and was being administered in hospitals worldwide. The lives saved were approaching 1 million. My other patents had spawned entire new industries. My laboratory employed over 200 researchers and had become the gold standard in biotechnology. The foundation had expanded internationally, with branches in 15 countries, helping thousands of young women pursue careers in science and technology. I'd bought out the remaining shareholders of Dad's company and restructured it completely, transforming it from a struggling software firm into a biotech powerhouse. Under my leadership, it was now worth 10 times what it had been when I'd taken over. I'd been named one of Fortune's most powerful women, one of Forbes's self-made billionaires, and had received honorary doctorates from 7 universities. And yet, the moment that had meant the most had come on a quiet Sunday morning. I'd been visiting my mother's grave, something I did every year on her birthday. I'd been telling her about my successes, about the foundation in her name, about all the lives we were saving. "I did it, Mom," I'd said softly, placing fresh flowers on her headstone. "I became everything you believed I could be, everything you never got to see." She would have been so proud. I'd turned to find my father standing a few feet away, looking older than his years, carrying his own bouquet of flowers. We'd stood there in awkward silence for a moment before he'd spoken again. "I come here every week," he'd said, "to apologize, to tell her how badly I failed you both." "She can't hear you," I'd said, my voice not unkind but not warm either. "I know, but maybe you can." He'd set his flowers down next to mine, then straightened up. "I don't expect forgiveness, Claire. I don't deserve it. But I need you to know that you were right about everything. Patricia, Marcus, the company, your career. I was wrong, and you were right. And I'm sorrier than I know how to say." I'd looked at this man who'd once been my hero, who'd become my biggest disappointment, and tried to figure out what I felt. "I appreciate the apology," I'd finally said, but it doesn't change anything." "I know," he'd said. I just, I want you to know that I see you now. I see what you've built, who you've become, and I'm in awe." "You should have been in awe 18 years ago when I got into MIT," I'd said. "You should have been in awe when I won my first research grant, or published my first paper, or any of the 100 achievements that you dismissed because they didn't fit your narrow definition of success." "You're right," he'd agreed. "I should have. I should have been the father you deserved instead of the father I was." We'd stood there for a while longer, two people who shared DNA but little else, saying goodbye to the woman who should have been there to see all of this. Finally, I'd spoken. "I don't know if I'll ever be ready to have you in my life again, Dad. Maybe someday, but not now." "I understand," he'd said. "But if that day ever comes, I'll be here." I'd nodded and left him there at my mother's grave, walking toward my car and the life I'd built from ashes and determination. 10 years after my rebirth, exactly a month, decades since I'd woken up as an 18-year-old with a lifetime of memories and a burning need for justice, I'd been invited to give the commencement address at MIT. Standing at that podium, looking out at thousands of graduates and their families, I'd thought about the two lives I'd lived. The one where I'd died young, broken and stolen from, and this one, where I'd transformed pain into power. When I was 18, I'd begun. Someone told me that my career choice was stupid, that I should be practical, choose something marketable, aim lower. I'd pause, letting that sink in. I'm here to tell you to ignore every single person who tells you to make yourself smaller to fit their limited vision. The world will tell you to be realistic, to be practical, to settle for less than your dreams. Don't listen. I'd seen so many young faces looking up at me, filled with hope and fear and determination. But here's the thing they don't tell you about dreaming big. It's not enough to just dream. You have to work. You have to fight. You have to be willing to face failure and criticism and doubt from others and from yourself and keep going anyway. I'd thought about Marcus in that moment, about how he'd taken the easy route and lost everything, about how hard work and integrity always won in the long run, even when it didn't seem like it. Some of you will face people who underestimate you, who try to take credit for your work, who tell you that you're not good enough. Some of you will be betrayed by people you trust. Some of you will fail repeatedly before you succeed. I'd paused, my voice softening. And when that happens, I want you to remember this. Your worth is not determined by other people's inability to see it. Your potential is not limited by their lack of imagination. Your success is not dependent on their approval. The applause had started then, but I'd raised a hand. You are the architects of your own lives. Build something extraordinary. Build something that matters. Build something that proves every single person who doubted you was wrong. I'd smiled. And then build something even better just because you can. The standing ovation had lasted 10 minutes. Afterward, at the reception, dozens of graduates had approached me with stories of their own. Family members who didn't support them, people who'd stolen their ideas, obstacles that seemed insurmountable. To each one, I'd said the same thing. You're stronger than you know, and you can do harder things than you imagine. Don't let anyone, not family, not friends, not society, convince you otherwise. That night, alone in my hotel room, I'd pulled out my phone and looked at the folder I'd created on my rebirth day. Inside were photos from my previous life, or rather, the life that would have been. My grave, Marcus's Forbes interview, the article about Dad's company collapse. I kept them as reminders, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd gained. I'd gained the knowledge that I was stronger than any obstacle. I'd gained the confidence that came from building an empire with my own hands. I'd gained the satisfaction of knowing that everyone who'd underestimated me had lived to see how wrong they were. But most importantly, I'd gained something I'd never had in my previous life. The unshakable knowledge of my own worth. I didn't need my father's approval anymore. I didn't need Marcus's respect. I didn't need Patricia's acceptance. I was Dr. Claire Chen, scientist, entrepreneur, philanthropist, and proof that the best revenge was massive success. My treatment had saved 1.2 million lives and counting. My foundation had helped thousands of young women achieve their dreams. My companies employed over 5,000 people and were valued at over $10 billion. And I'd done it all myself. Well, not quite all myself. I'd had grandma, who'd believed in me when no one else would. I'd had mentors and colleagues who'd supported my work. I'd had a second chance that most people never got. But I'd taken that second chance and built something that would outlast me, something that would continue to make a difference long after I was gone. I'd made my mother proud. I'd proved my doubters wrong. I'd saved lives and changed the world, and in the end, that was worth more than all the family approval and recognition I'd once desperately craved. I deleted the folder, I didn't need those reminders anymore, and opened my email instead. There were dozens of messages, as usual. Research updates, foundation applications, meeting requests. But one caught my eye. A message from a young woman who'd received one of our scholarships. Dear Dr. Chen, it began. I wanted to let you know that I just got accepted into MIT's biochemistry program. When I told my family, they said I was wasting my time, that I should choose something more practical. But then I read your story and I realized that I don't need their approval to chase my dreams. Thank you for showing me that it's possible to succeed, even when the people who should support you don't. You've inspired me to prove them wrong, just like you did. I'd smiled, wiping away tears I didn't remember shedding, and started typing my response. Dear future scientist, I'd written. Welcome to MIT. Welcome to the fight. Welcome to the rest of your extraordinary life. You've got this. And if you ever doubt that, remember, someone once told me my career choice was stupid. After my rebirth, I earned more than his entire family combined. Not because I wanted revenge, though that was a nice bonus, but because I refused to let anyone else define my worth or limit my potential. Now go out there and do the same. The world needs what only you can create. I'd hit send and close my laptop, feeling more at peace than I had in either of my lives. Tomorrow, I'd wake up and continue the work. There were more treatments to develop, more lives to save, more young women to mentor. But tonight, I'd rest, knowing that I'd taken the broken pieces of my first life and forged them into something beautiful in my second. I'd won, completely, utterly, and in every way that mattered. And that was the best revenge of all.